There's something strangely uncomfortable about the trailer for, and I mean that in the best possible way, because the first 30 seconds almost trick you into thinking you're about to watch another glossy, Hollywood identity swap comedy where two people wake up in each other's bodies and spend 90 minutes making exaggerated facial expressions in front of bathroom mirrors. The marketing even leans into that expectation at first. Bright suburban lighting, a polished kitchen, a husband making coffee half awake while his wife scrolls through emails on a tablet, their teenage daughter complaining in the background. It feels familiar on purpose, safe, predictable, like the movie wants your guard completely down before it quietly changes tone without warning. And the second that tone shifts, you realize this thing is playing a very different game. The trailer opens on Evelyn Mercer, played by Rebecca Ferguson, and honestly, Ferguson has become one of those actors who can make emotional exhaustion feel cinematic without overplaying it. She's sitting in her car outside a grocery store at night, just staring forward while rain hits the windshield and the camera doesn't rush the moment. That's important. The trailer editor lets silence breathe for almost 6 seconds, which is unusually confident for modern marketing. No loud sting, no narration, just a woman who clearly hasn't slept properly in months. Then it cuts to Daniel Mercer, played by Jake Gyllenhaal, and he's giving one of those restrained performances where you can already tell there's a lot happening underneath the dialogue. He's at work in a biotech lab explaining memory mapping software to investors, and the trailer intentionally cross-cuts his professional confidence with shots of his collapsing personal life. Missed calls from Evelyn, empty dinner tables, their daughter Lily avoiding eye contact during breakfast. Tiny details, but they build tension fast. What grabbed me immediately is that the trailer never explains the central science too early. Most studios today are terrified audiences will get confused for even half a second, so trailers over-explain everything. This one doesn't. Instead, it gives fragments, a neural interface, a trial run, a warning from another scientist saying, "You still don't know what consciousness does under stress." That line lands because the trailer doesn't stop to underline it. It trusts you to remember it later. Then comes the scene everybody online started talking about after the teaser dropped. Daniel wakes up in Evelyn's body, but the reason it works isn't because of the body swap itself. Movies have done that forever. What makes this feel unsettling is the way the trailer presents identity as something fragile instead of comedic. Ferguson suddenly changes posture completely. The performance becomes physically different in a very subtle way. Shoulders tighter, faster blinking, slight panic hidden under forced control. You can instantly tell she's playing Daniel inside Evelyn's body without making it cartoonish. And then Gyllenhaal does the reverse. There's a shot where he walks through the hallway wearing Evelyn's oversized gray sweater while staring at his own hands with this horrifying mixture of disbelief and grief. Not panic. Grief. Like he already understands something irreversible has happened before the audience fully catches up. That's when the music changes. The first half of the trailer uses soft piano notes and distant ambient sound design. But once the swap happens, the soundtrack shifts into these low synthetic pulses that almost resemble a slowing heartbeat. It reminded me a little of the psychological texture from mixed with the grounded emotional paranoia of, except this trailer feels colder than both of those movies, less stylized, more emotionally clinical. One thing I genuinely appreciate is how carefully the trailer avoids revealing whether the swap was accidental or intentional. That ambiguity gives the entire thing tension. There's a moment where Evelyn, or technically Daniel inside Evelyn, says, "You knew this could happen," and the trailer immediately cuts before we hear the response. Smart editing. Very smart editing. because now the audience starts building theories instantly. Was Daniel secretly experimenting on consciousness transfer? Did Evelyn volunteer? Is somebody manipulating both of them? Or, and this is the theory I actually think the movie is hinting toward, did the technology expose truths about their marriage they were already refusing to confront? Because buried underneath the science fiction angle, the trailer keeps returning to emotional distance. That seems to be the real obsession of the film. There's one heartbreaking moment where Lily looks at Daniel's body, now occupied by Evelyn, and quietly says, "You finally listen to me now." That line is brutal because it tells you everything about this family dynamic without exposition. And honestly, I think that's why the trailer has connected with people online in a way the studio probably didn't fully expect. People aren't reacting to the sci-fi concept first. They're reacting to the emotional discomfort, the idea that somebody might understand you better only after literally becoming you. That's dark. Like, genuinely dark when you sit with it for a minute. The visual language of the trailer also deserves real credit because director Michael Arden clearly understands restraint. So many psychological thrillers today drown themselves in blue-gray color grading and hyperactive editing to convince audiences they're serious. This trailer does the opposite. It keeps the camera surprisingly still. Long hallway shots. Reflections and mirrors. Wide frames where characters stand emotionally disconnected from each other, even when they're only a few feet apart. There's a beautiful shot midway through the trailer where Evelyn's body sits at the edge of a swimming pool at night, while Daniel's body watches from inside the house through glass doors. Neither character moves. No dialogue. But visually, it communicates complete emotional separation. It's one of those images that sticks in your brain hours later. And then the trailer gets even stranger. About halfway through, tiny glitches start appearing in scenes. Not digital glitches exactly, more like memory distortions. A coffee mug changes position between cuts. A family photo briefly shows different facial expressions. There's a blink and you'll miss it shot, where Daniel looks into a mirror and sees himself as a child for less than a second. That detail completely changed my expectations for the movie. Because suddenly it doesn't feel like a simple consciousness transfer story anymore. It starts feeling like identity itself is becoming unstable, like memory, personality, and trauma are bleeding into each other. The trailer hints that swapping bodies may not just exchange perspective, it may dissolve personal boundaries entirely. And if the film commits fully to that idea, this could end up being one of the more psychologically ambitious mainstream thrillers we've seen in years. Now, I do think the trailer carefully avoids showing too much of the third act, because modern audiences are exhausted by trailers that spoil entire movies. Warner Horizon actually showed surprising discipline here. We get tension escalation, but not clear narrative resolution. You see police lights, a broken laboratory window, someone screaming underwater, Daniel running through a hospital corridor, Evelyn crying in a parking garage. But none of it forms a complete puzzle yet. Even the dialogue choices are restrained. There's almost no exposition dump. Nobody says, "We switched bodies because the machine malfunctioned." Nobody explains rules to the audience like a science lecture. Instead, the trailer leans heavily into fragmented emotional statements. You don't know what it feels like inside my head. You stopped seeing me years ago. If we stay like this too long. That last line cuts off before finishing, which is exactly the kind of editing choice that fuels audience curiosity instead of killing it. I also think casting was crucial here because this concept could have collapsed instantly with less disciplined actors. Gyllenhaal and Ferguson both understand internalized performances. Neither actor relies on exaggerated emotional signaling. You believe them because they behave like people actively suppressing panic rather than performing panic outwardly. There's one sequence near the end of the trailer that honestly gave me chills the first time I saw it. Daniel, trapped in Evelyn's body, watches old home videos alone at night. The footage shows happier versions of their family from years earlier. Birthdays, vacations, Christmas mornings. And while the footage plays, the trailer overlays audio from an earlier argument where Evelyn said, "You only love the version of me that needed you." That combination of imagery and dialogue suddenly reframes the whole movie. It stops being about technology. It becomes about possession, about intimacy, about whether love survives once illusion disappears. And I know that sounds heavy for a mainstream thriller, but the trailer really does suggest the film is aiming higher emotionally than most studio sci-fi right now. The final minute becomes increasingly fragmented. Faster cuts, sirens, rainstorms, flickering fluorescent lights, somebody smashing hard drives in a lab, Lily crying in the back seat of a car, Daniel whispering, "I can feel you disappearing." Then there's this terrifying final image where both characters stare at each other across a hospital room and simultaneously say, "Which one of us is real now?" Cut to black. No loud orchestra hit. No final joke. Just silence. Honestly, that silence is what sold me most. Because confident thrillers know when to stop talking. The thing that stayed in my head after that trailer wasn't even one specific scene. It was the emotional temperature of it. You know how some movies reveal themselves immediately? You watch the preview, and within 2 minutes you already understand exactly what emotional lane the film is operating in. You know where the laughs are coming from, where the jump scares are hiding, where the inspirational ending is probably heading. Doesn't feel like that at all. The trailer almost behaves like it's hiding something from the audience emotionally, not just narratively, and there's a huge difference between those two things. A mystery movie can hide plot twists. A psychologically intelligent movie hides emotional truth. That's much harder to pull off. The more I replayed the trailer, the more I started noticing how carefully the performances are calibrated around identity erosion. There's this tiny moment early on where Evelyn is brushing her teeth while Daniel talks to her from another room, and she doesn't answer him right away. The camera lingers on her face in the mirror for maybe 3 seconds longer than expected. It's such a normal domestic image, but the silence inside that moment feels enormous. Like these people stopped communicating honestly years before the science fiction premise even begins. That matters, because great speculative fiction usually works best when the fantasy element exposes a human problem that already existed underneath the surface. The swap isn't creating their marriage issues. It's exposing them in the most invasive way possible. And honestly, that's what makes this trailer feel more mature than a lot of recent high-concept studio thrillers. The marketing isn't screaming, "Look at the cool concept." It's asking something much more uncomfortable. If you truly experienced another person's inner life, would you still judge them the same way? That's heavy territory for a mainstream release. There's also an almost old-school patience to the cinematography that I really miss in modern Hollywood thrillers. Director Michael Arden seems deeply interested in physical space and emotional distance. Characters are constantly framed through doorways, reflections, security monitors, mirrors, or windows. Even before the swap happens, the movie visually separates everybody from one another. It quietly reinforces the idea that people can live together for years while still remaining emotionally unreachable. One of the strongest shots in the trailer barely lasts 2 seconds. Daniel stands in the kitchen late at night, drinking water, and behind him, out of focus, Evelyn sits alone at the dining table in darkness. Neither character looks at the other. No dialogue, no dramatic confrontation, but visually, it tells you everything about emotional isolation inside long-term relationships. That kind of filmmaking usually comes from directors who trust audiences to feel subtext instead of explaining it. And I'll be honest, I didn't expect that level of restraint from this project when it was first announced. Because when entertainment sites initially reported the premise months ago, a lot of people assumed this would be another slick streaming platform sci-fi movie that gets hyped for a weekend and disappears from public conversation 3 days later. The concept sounded dangerously close to territory. Hollywood has already recycled 100 times. Body swapping has existed forever in film. Comedy versions, horror versions, family versions, teen versions. But the trailer makes something immediately clear. This isn't about novelty. It's about psychological invasion. That's a very different engine. The sound design especially deserves attention because whoever cut this trailer understood how to weaponize silence. Modern trailers are terrified of quiet moments. Everything now is giant percussion hits, bass drops, rapid-fire editing, slowed-down pop songs, and dialogue designed to become TikTok audio clips. This trailer rejects almost all of that. There are long stretches where all you hear is breathing, footsteps, rain, electrical hums, a refrigerator buzzing in the background. Tiny domestic sounds suddenly feel eerie once identity becomes unstable. There's a sequence around the middle where Evelyn, inhabited by Daniel, walks through the family home alone at 3 a.m., and the trailer almost turns ordinary suburban silence into horror. Floorboards creak. The air conditioning clicks on. Somebody upstairs shifts in bed. The camera moves slowly through hallways, like the house itself no longer feels familiar. And then you realize why that scene works emotionally. Home has become psychologically foreign. That's terrifying in a way monsters never are. Another thing I appreciate is that the trailer never portrays the body swap as empowering. A lot of Hollywood stories would treat this premise like an opportunity for self-discovery fantasy. Now I understand your life. Now we appreciate each other, but every frame here suggests the opposite. The experience looks traumatic, violating, emotionally destabilizing. There's a disturbing shot where Daniel, trapped inside Evelyn's body, begins mimicking her facial expressions in front of a mirror, like he's studying a stranger he's forced to impersonate. Not in a comedic way either. More like somebody trying to survive undercover. That image says so much about performance inside relationships, about how people gradually learn to behave according to what others expect from them, and the movie seems obsessed with that idea. Who are you when nobody's looking? Who are you when somebody else literally controls your appearance? Who owns identity once consciousness and physical form become disconnected? Those questions are all floating underneath the trailer, without the script ever directly announcing them. That's smart writing. There's also a fascinating tension between emotional realism and speculative science. The trailer never becomes overly technical. It avoids drowning viewers in exposition about neural mapping or consciousness algorithms. Instead, the science stays partially abstract, which keeps focus on human behavior rather than mechanics. Personally, I think that's the correct creative choice. Once movies start over-explaining fictional technology, emotional momentum usually dies. Here, the uncertainty actually helps the atmosphere. The machine feels dangerous, precisely because it's not fully understood. One line from the trailer keeps replaying in my head. You copied the pattern. You didn't copy the soul. That's such an interesting line because it introduces philosophical horror into the concept. What if the swap isn't clean? What if consciousness leaves residue behind? What if memory transfer changes people permanently? Suddenly, the movie isn't just asking whether two people can survive exchanging bodies. It's asking whether identity itself can survive duplication. And that's where the trailer starts feeling almost existential, especially during the final montage. You notice brief flashes suggesting the characters are beginning to absorb fragments of each other psychologically. Evelyn starts repeating Daniel's gestures unconsciously. Daniel develops her speech rhythms. One shot even implies they're sharing memories they never personally experienced. That's nightmare fuel if you really think about it. Because eventually, the question becomes terrifyingly simple. At what point do you stop being yourself? I also think the trailer is intentionally hiding how dark this movie actually gets. The marketing still presents itself as prestige sci-fi drama, but there are flashes that suggest something closer to psychological horror underneath. There's blood on bathroom tiles, somebody violently smashing surveillance cameras, Lily screaming while refusing to let either parent touch her, a quick shot of Daniel physically recoiling from his own reflection. And there's another moment that people online have been dissecting frame by frame. Near the end, Evelyn's body whispers, "I remember dying." That line lasts maybe 1 second. No explanation, no context, just enough to completely destabilize audience assumptions. Because now, the trailer implies the swap process may involve something far more dangerous than consciousness transfer. Maybe death itself becomes temporarily accessible during the procedure. Maybe identity fractures. Maybe copies are being created. Maybe one version survives while another doesn't. The trailer never answers any of it. And that ambiguity is probably the smartest marketing decision Warner Horizon could have made. Studios keep forgetting audiences enjoy uncertainty when it's handled carefully. People like discussing possibilities. They like building theories. They like feeling slightly haunted after a trailer ends instead of immediately understanding every narrative beat. That's exactly what happened here. The online reaction became interesting because discussions shifted away from, will this movie be good, toward what is actually happening in this movie. Those are two completely different audience responses. Curiosity creates longevity. Confusion alone doesn't, but controlled ambiguity absolutely does. And then there's the emotional centerpiece of the trailer, Lily. I genuinely think the daughter character might end up being the heart of the entire film. Because while Daniel and Evelyn spiral into identity collapse, Lily seems to become the only person capable of recognizing emotional truth beyond physical appearance. The trailer quietly suggests she starts understanding which parent is actually inside which body before anyone tells her directly. There's one devastating exchange where she looks at Daniel's body and says softly, "Mom never stands like that." That line destroyed me the first time I heard it, because it's such a human observation. Children recognize emotional behavior more accurately than adults sometimes. They notice posture, timing, energy, tiny details adults overlook. And if the film really commits to that perspective, it could turn Lily into the emotional anchor, preventing the movie from becoming cold or overly cerebral, which honestly matters, because high concept sci-fi collapses fast when it forgets emotional grounding. The best examples always remember that spectacle means nothing without recognizable human fear underneath it. Understood loneliness, understood grief, understood memory and regret. And from what this trailer suggests, understands emotional estrangement inside modern relationships. That's a surprisingly rich foundation for a movie that, on paper, could have easily become gimmicky. Even visually, the trailer keeps reinforcing emotional duality. Warm household lighting contrasts with sterile laboratory interiors. Reflections constantly split faces into fragments. Mirrors appear in nearly every major scene. Sometimes characters are framed twice in the same shot through glass surfaces, almost like the film is visually duplicating identity before the swap even occurs. There's a brilliant image near the end, where Daniel's reflection moves half a second later than his actual body. Tiny detail, deeply unsettling. And the trailer wisely doesn't explain whether that moment is literal or psychological. Honestly, the older I get, the more I appreciate movies willing to trust atmosphere instead of noise. This trailer feels crafted rather than assembled. There's intention behind pacing, silence, framing, and performance choices. Nothing feels algorithmically designed for social media clips. It feels like somebody genuinely wanted to create lingering emotional unease instead of disposable excitement. That alone already makes it stand out in the current studio landscape. What fascinates me most is how the trailer keeps blurring the line between emotional intimacy and emotional trespassing. Because the more footage they reveal, the less the body swap feels metaphorical, and the more it starts feeling invasive, in a way Hollywood usually avoids. Most films with this premise stop in empathy. They treat identity exchange like a lesson. Walk in somebody else's shoes, understand their pain, become a better person. But every scene in suggests the opposite outcome. Understanding somebody completely may actually destroy your ability to love them normally. That's a terrifying idea for a mainstream psychological thriller to explore. There's a moment buried in the second trailer, and it's very quick, where Evelyn, inside Daniel's body, opens a hidden folder on his laptop and suddenly starts crying, without any dramatic reaction shot or exposition. The camera stays behind her shoulder. You never see the screen clearly. You only see her posture change. Her breathing gets uneven. She slowly closes the laptop afterward, like she wishes she hadn't looked. That's the kind of scene that tells me the movie probably understands restraint emotionally. A weaker script would immediately reveal whatever shocking secret she discovered. This trailer doesn't. And because it doesn't, your imagination starts doing the work instead. Was Daniel hiding an affair? Medical records? Evidence about the experiment? Private recordings? Or maybe something even sadder. Maybe she discovers he was emotionally unraveling long before the swap happened and simply didn't know how to ask for help. That uncertainty gives the entire trailer emotional weight. And honestly, I think audiences are craving movies like this again. Are not necessarily slow movies, because this clearly still has thriller pacing underneath it, but movies that allow emotional ambiguity to exist without immediately flattening everything into obvious heroes and villains. Because right now, one of the smartest things the marketing is doing is refusing to tell viewers who's morally right. Daniel isn't framed as a genius savior. Evelyn isn't framed as a neglected victim. Both seem flawed. Both seem emotionally exhausted. Both seem capable of hurting each other in ways they probably don't even fully understand. That complexity is rare in studio thrillers now, because studios usually panic that audiences won't connect unless morality is simplified. But real relationships are messy. Real marriages contain years of unspoken resentment, small betrayals, emotional misunderstandings, moments of selfishness, and periods where two people slowly stop recognizing each other while pretending everything is still normal. This trailer seems deeply interested in that emotional decay. Even before the science fiction premise begins, the marriage already feels haunted. That's why the body swap concept works here. It externalizes emotional alienation physically, and visually, the film appears obsessed with the idea of familiarity becoming uncanny. Ordinary spaces gradually start looking threatening the longer the trailer continues. Kitchens feel cold, bedrooms feel sterile. Family photographs suddenly seem eerie because identity itself can no longer be trusted. One of the most unsettling shots happens in complete silence. Daniel, trapped inside Evelyn's body, walks past a framed wedding photo hanging in the hallway and stops to stare at it. The camera slowly pushes in. He touches the glass gently with 2 fingers. And for a second, you can't tell whether he misses his own body, his old marriage, or the version of their relationship that no longer exists. That ambiguity is emotionally mature filmmaking. The trailer also seems incredibly aware of modern fears surrounding identity and emotional disconnection in the digital age. There's a recurring motif involving recorded memories, phones, voice notes, archived videos, security footage, neural scans. The movie appears fascinated by the idea that modern people constantly document themselves while simultaneously becoming less emotionally knowable. There's a chilling line from one of the researchers that barely made it into the international trailer cut. Memory isn't truth, it's reconstruction. That single sentence suddenly reframes everything, because now the swap process may not simply transfer consciousness. It may reconstruct identity imperfectly, meaning both characters could slowly become altered copies rather than authentic selves. And if that's the direction the story takes, this movie could end up exploring psychological territory closer to existential horror than traditional sci-fi drama. I noticed something else too, during repeated trailer viewings. The editing subtly changes once the swap occurs. Before the experiment, scenes flow naturally with standard continuity. Afterward, cuts become slightly disorienting. Eye lines don't always perfectly match. Dialogue overlaps strangely. Tiny continuity shifts appear intentionally incorrect. At first, you almost think you imagined it, but the effect builds subconsciously. The audience starts feeling psychologically unstable alongside the characters. That's incredibly sophisticated trailer construction, if intentional, and honestly, I think it absolutely is. Because the trailer repeatedly hints that perception itself becomes unreliable after consciousness separation. Characters begin questioning their memories. Certain conversations appear twice from different emotional angles. One hallway scene repeats with slightly altered dialogue later in the trailer. You start wondering whether reality is fragmenting or whether the characters are. And psychologically, that's far more disturbing than simple body swap mechanics. There's also this recurring visual motif involving water that I think is going to matter heavily in the full film. Rainstorms, bathtubs, pools, sinks overflowing, reflection distortions, near-drowning imagery. Water traditionally symbolizes rebirth or transformation in cinema, but here it feels dangerous, like identity dissolving rather than cleansing. One haunting image shows Evelyn submerged underwater while hearing Daniel's voice speaking from above the surface. The sound design muffles everything except fragments of dialogue. You said, "Don't remember. Leave me there." The words become incomplete underwater echoes. That's nightmare logic. And it gives the trailer this dreamlike psychological texture where emotional memory starts overtaking physical reality. Honestly, it reminds me less of modern blockbuster storytelling and more of paranoid 1970s psychological cinema, where movies trusted atmosphere enough to unsettle audiences without constantly explaining themselves. There's a little bit of in the emotional instability, a little bit of in the surveillance paranoia, a little bit of in the identity fragmentation. But the film still looks emotionally accessible enough for mainstream audiences, which is a difficult balance to maintain. And I really have to give credit to Jake Gyllenhaal here, because this kind of material can become ridiculous instantly with the wrong performance style. If he leaned too theatrical, the whole thing would collapse into melodrama. Instead, his acting in the trailer feels frighteningly internalized. Watch his eyes carefully after the swap scenes. He's constantly observing people like somebody studying a world he no longer belongs to. There's one dinner table sequence where he accidentally responds too slowly after Lily asks a question, and the discomfort on his face is almost painful because he's trying to imitate emotional familiarity in real time. That's such a smart behavioral detail. Meanwhile, Rebecca Ferguson approaches the role differently. Her version of Daniel, inside Evelyn's body, feels more emotionally aggressive, more restless, more visibly trapped. You can immediately tell these are two different consciousnesses inhabiting bodies that no longer feel natural to them. And the fact the performances remain emotionally distinct without becoming exaggerated impersonations is honestly impressive. The trailer's final act especially starts leaning into paranoia hard. Locks changing, phone calls ending abruptly, researchers deleting files. A scene where Evelyn's body runs barefoot through a hospital corridor while alarms blare in the background. Then there's this absolutely horrifying image where Daniel sees himself standing across the street watching him. Not a mirror reflection, not a hallucination, framed clearly enough to dismiss. An actual second version. The trailer cuts away instantly afterward. That one shot exploded online because it introduces entirely new possibilities. Maybe consciousness duplication occurred. Maybe copies exist. Maybe neither character currently inhabits the original body anymore. Suddenly the movie's title, Swapped, starts feeling intentionally misleading. What if they didn't simply exchange places? What if something multiplied? That possibility transforms the film from intimate psychological drama into something almost metaphysical. And I love that the trailer refuses to clarify any of it. There's confidence in withholding information. Modern studio marketing rarely understands that anymore. Usually trailers reveal every emotional beat because executives fear ambiguity hurts engagement metrics. But mystery creates conversation. Conversation creates longevity. The reason people kept discussing trailers for films like, or wasn't because viewers understood everything immediately, it was because they didn't. Curiosity lingers longer than explanation. And honestly, the more I analyze this trailer, the more convinced I become that the real subject of the movie isn't science at all. It's emotional recognition. The fear that the people closest to us may never truly know who we are internally, or worse, that they eventually might. Because there's a devastating emotional contradiction buried underneath this premise. Most couples desperately want to feel understood, but complete understanding may eliminate illusion entirely. And illusion, to some extent, is part of what allows relationships to survive. We soften edges for each other. We curate ourselves unconsciously. We maintain emotional boundaries. This movie seems to ask what happens when those boundaries disappear completely. What survives afterward? Love, resentment, identity, or nothing at all? By the time the trailer reaches its final montage, it almost stops feeling like marketing and starts feeling like emotional collapse captured in fragments. Faces blur through reflections, dialogue overlaps, sirens distort into low industrial sound. Lily screams for her parents, while neither body fully responds correctly. Somebody destroys the neural interface equipment with a fire axe. Rain pounds against windows hard enough to drown out speech. And then comes that final line. Not shouted, barely whispered. If I stay here long enough, I think I become you. Cut to black. The first time I heard that line, I genuinely sat there for a minute after the trailer ended without clicking anything else, because it reframes the entire premise into something much sadder than body horror or psychological suspense. It turns identity into erosion, not sudden transformation, not magical switching, slow erosion. like two people emotionally dissolving into each other until neither one remains completely intact anymore. And honestly, that idea feels weirdly relevant right now. Not just in relationships either, in modern life generally. People spend so much time performing versions of themselves for work, family, social media, relationships, survival, expectations. Eventually, the question becomes uncomfortable. How much of your personality actually belongs to you anymore? That anxiety seems baked directly into the DNA of, and the trailer understands that without ever spelling it out in some clumsy monologue. That's why I think audiences connected to it emotionally faster than expected. Even viewers who normally don't care about cerebral science fiction started talking about the emotional implications online because the trailer presents the concept through recognizable human exhaustion instead of spectacle. You can feel years inside these characters. That matters. One of the most revealing scenes happens during a quiet kitchen argument shown briefly across multiple trailer cuts. Daniel, still trapped in Evelyn's body, accuses Evelyn, occupying his body, of changing intentionally after the swap. And Evelyn responds with this absolutely brutal line. "No, you just never noticed me before." That's not science fiction dialogue. That's marriage collapse dialogue. And it lands hard because the trailer never portrays either character as entirely innocent. Both seem trapped inside years of emotional neglect they barely understood until physical identity became unstable. The body swap almost functions like forced emotional confrontation. Suddenly they can't avoid each other's pain anymore because they're literally inhabiting it. But the movie also appears smart enough to understand empathy alone doesn't magically heal resentment. Sometimes understanding somebody better actually makes old wounds worse. That's such an emotionally adult idea for a studio thriller. The trailer keeps returning to tiny behavioral details that reinforce this. Daniel notices how often Evelyn apologizes automatically during conversations. Evelyn realizes Daniel experiences panic attacks he's been hiding privately for years. Both characters gradually discover internal truths the other never verbalized. And there's something deeply invasive about that. One shot that people haven't talked about enough shows Evelyn inside Daniel's body, sitting alone in his parked car after work. No music, no dialogue. She suddenly starts crying without warning. Not because of anything she consciously remembers, but because Daniel's body itself appears conditioned by accumulated emotional stress. That implication is fascinating. The body remembers things the mind suppresses. If the movie fully explores that concept, it could become emotionally devastating, because then identity stops being purely psychological. Trauma becomes physical. Memory becomes biological. Love becomes behavioral. And the trailer hints that both characters slowly realize they never truly understood how much pain the other person carried privately. At the same time, though, the film doesn't seem sentimental about reconciliation. This isn't framed like a therapeutic healing fantasy. The emotional atmosphere stays tense and increasingly paranoid. Understanding each other doesn't necessarily bring them closer. In some scenes, it actually appears to make them more frightened of one another. That's what gives the trailer its lingering unease. The closer the characters become psychologically, the more unstable reality seems to get. There's a terrifying moment where Daniel looks at Evelyn and quietly says, "I can hear your thoughts when you sleep." The trailer never explains whether that's metaphorical. And honestly, the fact it might not be metaphorical makes the whole thing even more disturbing. Because now, consciousness boundaries may be collapsing entirely. There are hints throughout the trailer that memories begin leaking uncontrollably between them. Shared dreams, emotional impulses, sudden flashes of childhood experiences that don't belong to the person experiencing them. One montage briefly shows both characters remembering the same birthday party from completely different emotional perspectives. That's such an interesting storytelling device because memory itself becomes unreliable. Whose version is true? Which emotional interpretation matters more? Can two people experience the same life event while carrying completely opposite emotional realities afterward? Of course they can. That's real life. And that's why the science fiction framework works so well here. It externalizes emotional subjectivity physically. Another thing I admire is how visually restrained the trailer remains despite increasingly surreal material. A lesser film would probably lean heavily into distorted imagery and aggressive visual effects once identity starts fracturing. But here, most scenes still look grounded and naturalistic. The horror comes from subtle behavioral wrongness rather than spectacle, a delayed reaction, an unfamiliar gesture, a husband recognizing his wife's body but not her mannerisms, a daughter realizing something emotionally impossible has happened before adults admit it aloud. That restraint makes everything scarier because it feels psychologically plausible inside the emotional reality of the film. There's one incredibly effective sequence involving Lily that honestly might be the emotional center of the whole movie. She sits between her parents during a tense breakfast after the swap, silently observing both of them while they argue about procedure protocols and neurological stability. Then she interrupts and says, "You both sound lonelier now." That line is incredible because it cuts through all the science fiction mechanics instantly. The movie isn't really about switching bodies. It's about emotional disconnection becoming impossible to hide anymore. And the trailer repeatedly suggests Lily sees the truth clearer than either adult does. Children in movies are often written unrealistically, either too wise or too clueless. But this trailer seems to understand something authentic about kids in dysfunctional households. They notice emotional shifts immediately. They may not understand technical explanations, but they absolutely recognize changes in emotional rhythm. There's another heartbreaking moment where Lily hugs Daniel's body, but then quietly pulls away because something feels wrong. No dramatic music, no horror sting, just emotional confusion. That kind of grounded discomfort hits harder than jump scares ever could. I also think the trailer is intentionally playing with audience expectations surrounding guilt and responsibility. At first, it seems obvious Daniel's experiment caused everything. But later footage suggests Evelyn may have made decisions the audience doesn't fully understand yet. There are glimpses of signed consent forms, deleted messages, arguments with researchers, secret meetings. The film appears determined to avoid easy blame, which is smart because relationships rarely collapse from one singular betrayal. Usually damage accumulates slowly through years of emotional avoidance, selfishness, miscommunication, resentment, exhaustion, and silence. This trailer feels deeply interested in silence. People constantly stop speaking halfway through sentences. Conversations end unfinished. Questions go unanswered. Characters stare at each other like language itself has become insufficient. And honestly, that's probably why the trailer feels more emotionally mature than most modern studio sci-fi. It understands that the scariest thing about intimacy isn't necessarily conflict. It's the realization that another person may never fully translate their internal world to you, even if they desperately want to, or worse, even if technology eventually forces them to. The marketing also deserves credit for not overusing explanatory narration. There's no omniscient voice telling audiences what to feel. The trailer trusts imagery and fragmented emotional moments enough to carry tension naturally. That confidence is rare, especially now. Studios usually assume audiences need constant stimulation or explanation every few seconds. This trailer moves differently. It breathes. It allows emotional discomfort to linger unresolved. Scenes sometimes end before the expected dramatic payoff arrives, and that creates psychological tension far more effectively than loud editing tricks. There's a scene near the end where Evelyn's body enters Daniel's childhood home alone. Dust floating in sunlight, empty rooms, faded wallpaper. The trailer barely shows anything specific there, but the emotional atmosphere changes immediately. You realize the swap has forced both characters to inherit each other's histories, not just physical appearances. That's horrifying when you really think about it. Because identity isn't just personality. It's accumulated memory, emotional scars, shame, habits, private fears. And suddenly, both characters are drowning inside emotional archives they never chose to access. One line from the international cut especially stayed with me. "We were already disappearing before the machine touched us." That might honestly be the core thesis of the whole movie. The science fiction event didn't create the emotional crisis. It exposed one already happening silently inside the marriage. And if the film fully commits to that emotional honesty, I think it could resonate far beyond typical thriller audiences. Because beneath the psychological mystery and speculative technology, there's something painfully recognizable here. Two people slowly losing sight of themselves while trying to stay connected to each other. That's universal. The trailer's final sequence keeps escalating visually. Emergency lights, collapsing servers, overlapping memories, fractured reflections. But emotionally, it stays grounded in grief rather than spectacle. Nobody looks empowered. Nobody looks heroic. Everybody looks emotionally overwhelmed by the realization that identity itself may be less stable than they believed. Then there's that last horrifying image before the title card. Daniel watches old footage of himself laughing with Evelyn years earlier. But in the footage, the other version of him suddenly looks directly into the camera. Not at Evelyn, at him, and smiles like it recognizes him. That line feels like the emotional thesis of the entire film, honestly, because it reframes everything we've been watching through a much sadder lens. The experiment didn't destroy a perfect marriage. It exposed two people who had already been quietly disappearing inside their own lives long before technology forced them to confront it. And that's what keeps this trailer from feeling gimmicky. Underneath the speculative premise seems painfully grounded in emotional realism. Not realism in the scientific sense, obviously. Consciousness transfer is still science fiction, but realism in the way long-term emotional erosion actually behaves. Relationships rarely collapse all at once. Usually people drift gradually. They become functional instead of emotionally visible to each other. Conversations become logistical. Intimacy becomes routine. Entire emotional worlds stay untranslated for years. This trailer understands that kind of loneliness almost too well. The more footage they release, the more obvious it becomes that the film isn't asking, what if two people switched bodies? It's asking something much more uncomfortable. How much of another person can you truly survive understanding? Because there's a point in the trailer where empathy stops looking healing and starts looking psychologically dangerous. There's a scene where Evelyn, trapped inside Daniel's body, discovers a memory he buried from childhood. The trailer only gives fragments, hospital lights, a younger Daniel sitting alone, distant arguing voices, but whatever she experiences clearly devastates her emotionally. Later, she tells him, "You built your whole personality around surviving that." That line says so much in so few words. The movie appears deeply interested in the invisible architecture of identity, the hidden emotional events shaping behavior underneath adulthood, tiny private traumas accumulating over years until they become personality itself. And suddenly the swap process becomes terrifying because it exposes emotional foundations people normally protect instinctively. One thing I genuinely admire is how mature the dialogue sounds throughout the trailer. Characters don't speak in exposition-heavy movie language. Nobody stands around explaining themes directly. Most conversations feel emotionally fragmented and incomplete, which is exactly how exhausted adults actually talk during emotional crisis. People interrupt themselves, avoid direct honesty, change subjects halfway through sentences. The trailer captures that natural emotional avoidance beautifully. There's a moment where Daniel almost says, "I love you," but instead asks if Evelyn slept okay. That tiny substitution tells you everything about their relationship dynamic. Emotional truth gets rerouted into practical conversation because vulnerability has become too difficult. That kind of writing detail is rare in mainstream thrillers, especially now. Modern studio dialogue often sounds engineered for social media clips instead of human interaction. This trailer feels observed rather than manufactured. It understands awkward pauses, emotional hesitation, contradictory feelings existing simultaneously, and because of that, the high-concept premise feels emotionally believable. The visual symbolism also keeps getting richer the more you analyze it. Throughout the trailer, characters constantly interact with duplicated versions of themselves indirectly. Reflections, recorded videos, surveillance feeds, memory scans, voice recordings, even photographs start functioning almost like ghostly alternate identities. The film appears obsessed with the difference between who we are internally and the versions of ourselves preserved externally. That's such a modern anxiety. Everybody now leaves digital traces everywhere: videos, texts, archived conversations, photos, but none of those fragments fully capture actual emotional identity. The trailer quietly weaponizes that discomfort. Characters begin confronting preserved versions of themselves that no longer feel emotionally recognizable. One deeply unsettling moment shows Daniel replaying an old voicemail from himself repeatedly because he can't remember if the voice still emotionally belongs to him. That's existentially horrifying. Imagine becoming psychologically detached from your own past self. The trailer suggests identity fragmentation may progress gradually, like memory decay, rather than instant transformation. Characters don't suddenly become different people overnight. They slowly absorb emotional residue from one another until behavioral boundaries blur completely. And honestly, that gradualness makes it scarier because it mirrors real emotional change. Nobody notices themselves changing day to day. Transformation only becomes visible afterward. There's also a fascinating undercurrent involving guilt throughout the trailer. Not just guilt over the experiment itself, but guilt over emotional neglect. Guilt over unspoken resentment. Guilt over failing to truly notice another person's suffering while sharing a life with them. One scene that hit me hard shows Evelyn watching security footage of herself, crying alone in the garage late at night, months before the swap occurred. She stares at the screen in disbelief, almost like she's witnessing a stranger. Then she whispers, "I don't even remember feeling this bad." That's devastating because it captures how people emotionally dissociate from their own unhappiness, sometimes just to function. The trailer seems deeply interested in emotional repression, how adults normalize private suffering until it becomes invisible even to themselves. And once the swap happens, all that hidden emotional material starts surfacing uncontrollably. There's another incredible sequence involving dreams bleeding between consciousnesses. Daniel begins remembering Evelyn's childhood memories as though they belong to him emotionally, not visually observing them, feeling them, embodying them. That distinction matters. The trailer repeatedly suggests empathy becomes physically immersive rather than intellectual. The characters don't simply understand each other conceptually. They inherit emotional reality directly, which sounds compassionate at first, until you realize how psychologically overwhelming that would become. Human beings survive partly because internal emotional boundaries exist. This movie seems fascinated by what happens once those barriers collapse entirely. There's one haunting image where Daniel wakes up crying from a nightmare he doesn't recognize, only for Evelyn to quietly say, "That wasn't yours." No music, no dramatic reveal, just horrifying emotional intimacy. And honestly, that's why the trailer works so well for me. It understands that the scariest things are often emotionally quiet. The horror isn't spectacle, it's recognition. The realization that another person contains entire emotional landscapes you never fully understood, despite loving them for years. The film's pacing also appears unusually patient for a studio release. The trailer never rushes emotional beats. It allows reactions to linger awkwardly. Characters often sit silently after difficult realizations, instead of immediately pushing plot forward. That restraint creates authenticity. People experiencing emotional shock don't always react theatrically. Sometimes they just become still. Jake Gyllenhaal especially seems to understand that kind of internalized acting rhythm. His performance throughout the trailer becomes progressively emptier emotionally in a way that feels deeply unsettling. Like Daniel is slowly losing the ability to recognize himself internally. Meanwhile, Rebecca Ferguson plays Evelyn's psychological unraveling differently, more emotionally overloaded, more visibly desperate to maintain stability, while drowning in emotional information she was never supposed to access. Their performances mirror each other without becoming symmetrical. That imbalance keeps the relationship feeling human, because real couples rarely process trauma identically. The trailer's sound design deserves another mention too, because it becomes increasingly subjective over time. Sounds distort according to emotional perspective. Heartbeats blend into industrial machinery. Dialogue echoes unnaturally during memory transfer scenes. Familiar household noises become threatening. At one point, Daniel hears Evelyn humming a song in another room, only to realize moments later she isn't home. Again, the trailer never clarifies whether this is psychological breakdown or something more metaphysical. That ambiguity is crucial. The movie appears committed to preserving emotional uncertainty rather than reducing everything to neat scientific explanation. And I love that. Too much contemporary science fiction treats mystery like a temporary inconvenience eventually solved through exposition. But emotionally rich stories understand some uncertainty should remain unresolved because identity itself remains unresolved. Who are we really? Memory, behavior, physical continuity, emotional history, the people others perceive us to be? The trailer keeps circling these questions without pretending definitive answers exist. One of the most emotionally brutal scenes happens near the end when Lily finally breaks down during dinner and screams, "I don't know which one of you misses me anymore." That line completely shattered me, because suddenly the film's emotional stakes crystallize perfectly. This isn't just about two adults losing themselves. It's about a child witnessing emotional disappearance in real time. And the trailer smartly frames that horror through absence rather than violence. Nobody attacks Lily. Nobody abandons her physically, but emotionally, her parents become increasingly unreachable while trapped inside identity collapse. That's devastatingly human science fiction. By the final montage, reality itself feels emotionally unstable. Memories overlap. Reflections move incorrectly. Recorded conversations change wording slightly. Daniel and Evelyn begin unconsciously mirroring each other's gestures, even while standing apart. The distinctions separating them are dissolving. And then the trailer delivers its final emotional gut punch. Evelyn asks softly, "If we forget who we were?" Long silence. Daniel responds, "Maybe that already happened." Cut to black. For a few seconds after that final cut, there's no music at all. Just silence. And honestly, that silence might be the smartest decision the trailer makes, because it leaves the audience sitting alone with the emotional implications instead of rushing to reassure them with spectacle or a final twist reveal. The movie seems to understand something modern thrillers often forget. Unease needs space. If you constantly bombard viewers with stimulation, nothing actually settles emotionally, but appears deeply committed to emotional aftershock. The trailer ends, yet the questions keep mutating in your head afterward. Were Daniel and Evelyn already emotionally fragmented before the experiment? Did the machine merely expose emotional truths hidden beneath routine? Or did it create entirely new versions of them that now coexist psychologically with the originals? The terrifying thing is, the trailer suggests all three possibilities simultaneously. And I think that's why people online became almost obsessive about analyzing tiny details frame by frame. Not because the movie looks confusing in the shallow internet sense, but because the emotional logic underneath it feels disturbingly plausible. Identity already shifts constantly in real life, depending on stress, memory, relationships, trauma, aging, expectation. The film just externalizes that instability through speculative science. There's one detail I noticed during the final montage that genuinely unsettled me. Daniel and Evelyn stop using each other's names. At first, I thought it was accidental editing, but once you notice it, it keeps happening. They speak directly without personal identifiers, almost like names themselves have stopped feeling emotionally reliable. That's such a subtle but brilliant behavioral touch. Because if consciousness boundaries collapse long enough, language itself would probably start failing emotionally. How do you refer to somebody once identity becomes psychologically unstable? Husband, wife, self, other. The trailer quietly allows those distinctions to erode, and the erosion spreads into everything. Home videos become threatening. Mirrors become confrontational. Physical touch becomes uncertain. Memory becomes contaminated. Even love itself starts feeling unstable because neither character fully trusts which emotions belong authentically to them anymore. There's a heartbreaking scene in one of the later preview clips where Daniel admits he can no longer tell whether certain feelings originated from him or from Evelyn bleeding emotionally into his consciousness. He says, "I miss things I never lived." That line alone could honestly define the whole movie. missing emotional experiences you never personally had. That's such a haunting concept because it turns empathy into inherited grief. The trailer repeatedly hints that emotional crossover becomes addictive too. That's another fascinating layer. At first, the characters resist the merging process desperately, but gradually, there are moments suggesting they begin craving access to each other's emotional worlds despite the damage it causes. That contradiction feels psychologically authentic. Human beings are naturally drawn toward intimacy, even when intimacy hurts us. One scene strongly implies Daniel deliberately revisits Evelyn's memories through the neural interface after learning it's dangerous. Not because he wants information anymore, but because experiencing her inner life temporarily makes him feel less emotionally isolated. That's incredibly sad when you think about it. The movie seems to argue that loneliness itself becomes intoxicatingly vulnerable once somebody finally understands it completely. But understanding doesn't necessarily heal anything. Sometimes it just destroys emotional distance. And maybe emotional distance is partially necessary for identity survival. That appears to be the central philosophical tension driving the film. The trailer also becomes increasingly dreamlike structurally near the end. Time loses clean continuity. Daylight transitions happen abruptly. Dialogue from different scenes overlaps emotionally. Characters appear emotionally exhausted in one scene and suddenly calm in another without obvious progression. Normally, that kind of fragmented editing could feel pretentious. Here, it feels psychologically motivated because the audience itself starts experiencing identity disorientation alongside the characters. You stop fully trusting narrative continuity. Memory and present tense begin blending together emotionally. One especially disturbing sequence shows Evelyn remembering an argument that Daniel insists never happened. But then later, Daniel recalls the same argument differently. The trailer never confirms which memory is accurate. That uncertainty matters enormously because memory isn't objective archival footage. It's emotional reconstruction shaped by perspective, shame, fear, longing, and self-protection. The movie appears deeply aware of that reality, which means the swap process doesn't simply transfer consciousness. It transfers subjective emotional truth, and subjective truth is messy, contradictory, incomplete, sometimes dishonest, without intending to be. The trailer never treats either character's memories as fully reliable. That choice gives the film emotional sophistication many thrillers lack. There's another extraordinary visual detail involving reflections that I can't stop thinking about. Throughout the trailer, mirrors initially show characters accurately, but later, reflections begin expressing delayed emotional reactions. Daniel remains expressionless, while his reflection appears devastated. Evelyn smiles politely, while her reflection looks frightened. It's subtle enough that casual viewers might miss it entirely, but subconsciously, it creates profound unease because internal emotional reality starts separating visibly from external behavior. That's basically the entire emotional premise of the movie condensed into imagery. People perform emotional stability externally while privately fragmenting internally. The experiment merely removes the barrier between those two states. I also appreciate how the trailer avoids reducing technology to either salvation or villainy. The neural transfer system itself feels morally ambiguous. The researchers aren't comic book mad scientists. Most seem genuinely idealistic initially. Their goal appears rooted in empathy, neurological healing, trauma recovery, maybe even preserving consciousness after death. That nuance matters. The film seems more interested in unintended emotional consequences than simplistic, science gone wrong cliches. One researcher says something incredibly revealing during a tense confrontation. We thought people wanted to be understood completely. Then after a pause, they don't. That line stuck with me because it cuts directly into the emotional paradox underneath intimacy. Most people crave understanding while simultaneously fearing exposure. We want connection, but we also need psychological privacy to preserve stable identity. The trailer suggests total emotional transparency may actually become unbearable, not because people are evil, because human consciousness was never designed for complete mutual access. That's such a rich idea for a mainstream film. And visually, the movie keeps grounding those abstract themes in intimate domestic spaces. Bedrooms, kitchens, hallways, cars parked outside grocery stores at night. The ordinary environments make the emotional horror feel personal instead of abstract. One scene absolutely wrecked me emotionally. Daniel, trapped inside Evelyn's body, folds laundry alone while listening to an old voice message from Lily. Halfway through the message, he suddenly realizes Evelyn performed this same invisible domestic routine every day while feeling emotionally unseen by everyone around her. The expression on his face isn't dramatic guilt, it's devastating recognition. And that's the kind of emotional maturity the trailer consistently demonstrates. The movie doesn't portray emotional neglect as monstrous cruelty. It portrays it as accumulated blindness. People becoming too exhausted, distracted, anxious, or emotionally closed off to fully notice one another anymore, which honestly feels much more truthful. The supporting cast also appears stronger than people initially expected. Sarah Paulson briefly appears as Dr. Naomi Vale, one of the lead neurologists behind the transfer technology, and she brings this exhausted moral intelligence to the role immediately. She doesn't act like somebody losing control of an experiment. She acts like somebody slowly realizing they misunderstood consciousness itself. That distinction gives the movie emotional credibility. Meanwhile, Lily never feels written merely as a concerned child character. She increasingly functions like the emotional conscience of the story, the only person consistently reacting to emotional truth rather than intellectual explanations. There's a devastating moment where she tells Daniel, "You both keep explaining things instead of feeling them." That line honestly summarizes the entire tragedy of the marriage. Two adults intellectually navigating emotional collapse while losing direct emotional connection in the process. And the trailer suggests the experiment amplifies that problem catastrophically. Once identity destabilizes, both characters become increasingly obsessed with defining reality logically instead of emotionally surviving it together. By the final stretch, the movie almost stops behaving like traditional narrative entirely. Scenes feel more like emotional fragments collapsing into one another. Childhood memories interrupt present conversations. Reflections contradict behavior. Audio loops repeat with altered emotional emphasis. And through all of it, the emotional core remains heartbreakingly simple. Two people realizing they stopped truly seeing each other long before they literally became unrecognizable. That's why the trailer works. Not because of clever science fiction mechanics. Because underneath all the identity horror, there's something painfully ordinary hiding there. The fear that somebody can share your entire life and still never fully know you. Oh, that image right there is the moment the trailer stops feeling like psychological drama and starts drifting into existential horror. Because suddenly the question isn't just whether consciousness can move between bodies. The question becomes whether identity can exist independently once it's been copied, observed, fractured, or remembered incorrectly enough times. And that idea lingers. It really lingers. Because the smile in that old footage doesn't play like a cheap horror movie scare. It feels intimate, familiar, almost sad. Like the movie is suggesting some version of Daniel already understood this collapse long before the experiment happened. The more I think about it, the more I suspect is less interested in science than in emotional permanence. Can people remain emotionally recognizable to each other over time? Or do relationships naturally create shifting versions of identity until eventually nobody is interacting with the real person anymore? That's heavy existential territory, hiding underneath what could have easily been marketed as a high-concept thriller gimmick. And honestly, the trailer earns that seriousness because it never feels smug about its ideas. That's important. Some modern psychological sci-fi films get trapped in their own cleverness. They become emotionally cold because the script is more interested in puzzles than people. This trailer avoids that trap almost completely. Every strange visual moment stays emotionally connected to the characters. That's why the unsettling imagery works. There's a sequence late in the trailer where Evelyn, trapped inside Daniel's body, sits in a therapist's office trying to explain the situation without revealing the truth outright. The therapist asks, "Do you feel disconnected from yourself?" And the way Rebecca Ferguson delivers Daniel's hesitation through body language alone is honestly incredible. Her eyes don't just look frightened. They look exhausted by the impossibility of explaining emotional reality accurately. That's such a human feeling. Sometimes trauma becomes impossible to describe because language itself feels too small for it. The trailer repeatedly circles around that emotional limitation. People struggle to explain themselves constantly throughout the footage. They stop mid-sentence. They reinterpret memories differently. They contradict earlier statements. Emotional truth keeps shifting depending on perspective, which, again, feels very intentional. Because the movie seems deeply fascinated by subjective identity. The idea that every person contains multiple versions of themselves depending on who's observing them. Who was Daniel to Evelyn? Who was Evelyn to Lily? Who were they privately when alone? And after the swap, which version survives? There's one tiny moment I nearly missed where Lily watches home videos by herself and starts labeling them aloud. That's dad at work. That's dad pretending. That's mom angry. That's mom before. Before what? The trailer cuts away before finishing the sentence, but that unfinished thought says everything. Children notice emotional transformations long before adults admit them openly. And honestly, I think Lily may secretly be the film's emotional narrator, even if she isn't literally narrating events. She seems to recognize the instability faster than anyone else, because children often observe emotional patterns more honestly than adults trapped inside denial. That dynamic could make the movie devastating if handled correctly, especially because the trailer strongly implies Lily becomes increasingly frightened not by the body swap itself, but by watching her parents psychologically unravel while trying to preserve the illusion of normalcy. There's this heartbreaking scene where she asks, "If you both become each other, do I lose both of you?" That line hit me harder than any of the sci-fi material, because beneath all the identity horror, the emotional stakes remain deeply personal. A child watching her parents disappear psychologically while still physically standing in front of her. That's tragic, and it gives the movie emotional gravity beyond clever conceptual storytelling. I also noticed how carefully the trailer handles physical touch, after the swap occurs. Almost every interaction becomes awkward, hesitant, or emotionally loaded. Characters constantly pull away from contact instinctively. Handshakes linger too long. Hugs feel unnatural. Even sitting beside each other carries tension. The film appears obsessed with the disconnect between emotional familiarity and physical recognition. You know this person, but you don't. That contradiction creates enormous psychological discomfort. One especially disturbing scene shows Daniel staring at Evelyn's sleeping body from across the room while inhabiting her appearance himself. Just typing that sentence sounds surreal, but the trailer stages it in a strangely mournful way rather than sensationalizing it. He doesn't look horrified. He looks lonely, like he's grieving his own existence. That emotional choice tells me the movie probably understands identity loss as a form of mourning. Not transformation, not adventure, mourning. And that's a much more emotionally sophisticated direction than most Hollywood thrillers would attempt. The visual storytelling reinforces this constantly. Reflections stop behaving normally. Family photographs become emotionally threatening. Mirrors dominate composition so aggressively that characters almost appear trapped inside layered versions of themselves. There's an extraordinary shot where Daniel's reflection remains motionless for half a second after he turns away from the mirror. No loud sound effect, no dramatic zoom, just subtle wrongness. Those are the moments that stay with audiences because they invade subconscious perception rather than announcing themselves loudly. Honestly, the trailer feels refreshingly confident in its audience's intelligence. It assumes viewers can interpret emotional implication without constant explanation. Even the editing rhythm supports that approach. Scenes rarely end on obvious punchlines or dramatic reveals. Instead, they fade into emotional uncertainty. Conversations overlap across different timelines. Audio from one memory bleeds into unrelated imagery. Reality gradually feels emotionally contaminated, and the deeper the trailer goes, the more it suggests the swap process isn't entirely technological anymore. Something psychological, maybe even spiritual, seems to be happening underneath it. Now, I don't necessarily mean literal supernatural horror. The movie still appears grounded overall. But the trailer increasingly implies that identity cannot be mapped cleanly like software. Human consciousness carries emotional residue. Memory alters perception. Trauma reshapes behavior biologically. One researcher says something fascinating during a laboratory sequence. The brain adapts faster than the self. That line opens enormous philosophical implications. If the body eventually accepts a new consciousness biologically, what happens to the original personality attached to that body? Does identity become chemically reshaped by physical experience? Can memory overwrite morality? Can emotional patterns transfer physically? The trailer never over-explains these questions, but it plants them carefully enough that they start haunting the audience afterward. And honestly, that's what separates memorable science fiction from disposable content. Memorable sci-fi gives viewers unresolved emotional questions to carry home with them. Disposable sci-fi explains everything before the credits roll. This trailer clearly wants discomfort to linger. The performances especially deserve attention because both leads are doing something unusually restrained. Jake Gyllenhaal avoids turning Daniel into a dramatic breakdown machine. Instead, he gradually empties emotionally across the trailer. His face becomes quieter, movement slower, eye contact weaker. It feels like somebody slowly detaching from their own identity in real time. Meanwhile, Rebecca Ferguson approaches the role with increasing internal panic hidden beneath forced composure. Her performance suggests somebody desperately trying to maintain behavioral control while psychologically fragmenting underneath. And together, Those approaches create this eerie imbalance where both characters appear emotionally displaced in opposite directions. One becoming emotionally absent, the other emotionally overloaded. That contrast is fascinating. The trailer's final montage especially leans hard into memory distortion. Old family videos begin changing subtly during playback. Dialogue from earlier scenes repeats with altered wording. Characters remember arguments differently. One terrifying shot shows Lily disappearing entirely from a photograph for less than a second. That image alone generated thousands of online theories. Is reality changing? Are memories being rewritten? Or are the characters simply losing their grip on stable perception? The trailer wisely refuses to answer. And because it refuses, audience anxiety grows naturally. There's also a recurring visual motif involving fluorescent lighting, flickering whenever emotional instability peaks. Hospitals, laboratories, parking garages, kitchens late at night. The flickering almost starts functioning like emotional static. Not supernatural exactly, more like reality struggling to stabilize itself psychologically. One sequence in particular genuinely unsettled me. Daniel wakes up alone in a hospital recovery room. The lights flicker softly overhead. He hears Evelyn's voice whispering his name somewhere nearby. He walks into the hallway and sees multiple versions of himself standing at different distances down the corridor. Not attacking, not moving, just watching him, silently. And then the trailer cuts, before explaining whether the moment is real, symbolic, or neurological. That ambiguity is everything. Because uncertainty allows fear to become personal. Everybody watching imagines something slightly different. By the end of the trailer, the emotional atmosphere feels almost suffocating. Not because of violence or spectacle, but because identity itself no longer feels dependable. The movie appears to ask a deeply uncomfortable question underneath all the science fiction mechanics. If another person experienced every hidden part of you completely, would they still love you? Or would they become you instead? And maybe that's the darkest possibility the trailer keeps circling without saying outright. That intimacy itself can become a form of erasure if emotional boundaries disappear completely. The more these characters understand each other, the less stable they seem individually. Love stops functioning like connection and starts functioning like absorption. That's why the atmosphere feels so emotionally suffocating by the end. Nobody in looks liberated by honesty. They look trapped by it. There's a really haunting moment in one of the extended preview clips where Daniel, still living inside Evelyn's body, watches her morning routine from years-old security footage. Not because he needs information, not because he's investigating something. He's watching because he realizes he barely noticed her actual daily existence during their marriage. That realization destroys him quietly. You can see it in the performance. The footage shows Evelyn waking up before everyone else, standing silently in the kitchen drinking coffee alone before sunrise, mentally preparing herself for another day nobody fully appreciates. Tiny details, exhaustion hidden inside routine. And Daniel watches like a stranger, observing a life he accidentally overlooked for 15 years. That emotional perspective shift feels painfully real. Long relationships sometimes create invisible versions of people. You stop seeing each other actively because familiarity replaces observation. The trailer seems obsessed with that phenomenon. Not dramatic betrayal necessarily, emotional blindness. And suddenly, the body swap concept becomes almost tragic. These people needed a technological catastrophe just to notice one another honestly again. But even then, the honesty arrives too late to feel comforting. There's another sequence where Evelyn, inside Daniel's body, experiences one of his panic attacks for the first time while driving alone at night. The scene in the trailer is cut beautifully, because there's no dramatic explanation. Her breathing changes. Streetlights blur. Sound drops out gradually. She grips the steering wheel harder and harder until her knuckles whiten. Then she whispers, "You were hiding this from me?" Not angrily, heartbroken. That distinction matters because the movie doesn't frame emotional secrecy as malicious. It frames it as survival. People conceal parts of themselves not always because they want to deceive others, but because they fear becoming emotionally burdensome. The trailer understands that kind of adult loneliness with uncomfortable accuracy. Honestly, I think that emotional realism is why the sci-fi elements work so well here. The speculative premise amplifies truths that already exist inside ordinary relationships. People already misunderstand each other constantly. People already project identities onto loved ones. People already fall in love with incomplete versions of one another. This movie simply literalizes those emotional dynamics through consciousness exchange. And the trailer is smart enough never to lose sight of that human foundation. Visually, I keep coming back to how restrained the production design feels. The world doesn't look futuristic in a distracting way. The laboratories are sleek but believable. Homes feel lived in. Offices feel emotionally sterile without looking exaggerated. Everything stays grounded enough that the psychological horror invades ordinary spaces naturally. That choice makes the entire concept more unsettling because it feels close enough to reality. One detail I absolutely love is how the trailer gradually removes visual warmth over time. Early scenes contain soft amber lighting inside the Mercer home. Family dinners still carry traces of intimacy, even during tense conversations. But after the swap, colder tones slowly dominate the frame. Whites become harsher. Shadows deepen. Reflections multiply. The environment itself starts feeling emotionally alien. And yet the movie never overdoes it stylistically. The cinematography stays elegant rather than flashy. Director Michael Arden clearly trusts emotional atmosphere more than visual gimmicks. That confidence extends to pacing too. There are long moments in the trailer where absolutely nothing exciting happens conventionally. Characters simply sit with emotional discomfort, watching old memories, listening to breathing, existing inside silence. Modern studio marketing usually cuts those moments away because executives fear audiences will lose attention. But those are the exact moments making this trailer memorable. The stillness creates tension because the audience starts waiting for reality to malfunction emotionally rather than physically. And when it finally does, the effect lands harder. There's one sequence involving mirrors that honestly might become iconic if the full film handles it correctly. Daniel walks through the house at night, turning off lights room by room. Every time darkness falls, his reflection lags slightly behind him in nearby mirrors. Not enough to feel supernatural immediately, just enough to feel psychologically wrong. The trailer never zooms in, never underlines it. It trusts viewers to notice subconsciously. That's sophisticated horror language. The best psychological thrillers understand that subtle perception errors disturb audiences more deeply than obvious monsters because they mimic the instability of actual anxiety. Reality doesn't collapse loudly at first. It becomes slightly incorrect around the edges. This trailer captures that sensation beautifully. Another fascinating layer is how the film appears to question whether empathy has ethical limits. Society constantly treats empathy as unquestionably virtuous. Understand others better, feel their pain, walk in their shoes, but seems interested in the possibility that some emotional boundaries exist for necessary psychological reasons. What happens if privacy disappears completely? Not digital privacy, emotional privacy, mental privacy. Can a relationship survive total psychological transparency? The trailer increasingly suggests the answer may be no. Because as Daniel and Evelyn gain access to each other's hidden emotional realities, they don't simply become compassionate, they become overwhelmed. Years of suppressed resentment, insecurity, fear, disappointment, longing, and loneliness begin flooding between them uncontrollably. One devastating moment shows Evelyn listening to an old voicemail where Daniel almost admitted he wanted to leave the marriage years earlier. Not because he stopped loving her, because he no longer recognized himself inside their life together. That's such a painfully adult kind of sadness, not explosive hatred, identity exhaustion. And the trailer repeatedly returns to that idea, the fear of becoming emotionally unrecognizable over time. There's also something really interesting happening with the supporting characters. The researchers surrounding the experiment don't behave like cartoonishly unethical movie scientists. Most of them seem frightened too, confused, emotionally compromised by witnessing something they no longer fully understand. One researcher quietly tells another, "We thought consciousness was information." Then after a long silence, "It isn't." That line feels incredibly important because it suggests the experiment fundamentally misunderstood human identity from the beginning. Consciousness cannot simply be transferred like data because emotional existence contains something messier, more unstable, more relational. Memory shapes identity. Relationships shape memory. Trauma reshapes relationships. Everything contaminates everything else. The trailer keeps building toward that realization emotionally. And then there's the possibility, hinted at more strongly during later footage, that the swap process may not actually be reversible anymore. That possibility changes the emotional stakes entirely. At first, audiences assume the goal is restoring normalcy, switch them back, fix the accident. But later scenes suggest the characters themselves may no longer know who the original versions are psychologically, if your memories merge, if your emotional instincts change, if your body adapts neurologically. What exactly gets restored? The trailer refuses easy answers. And honestly, thank God for that. Too many modern thrillers become terrified of ambiguity by the final act. They over-explain every mystery because executives mistake clarity for satisfaction. But psychologically rich stories need unresolved emotional tension sometimes. Real identity isn't cleanly explainable. Neither are relationships. The final stretch of the trailer especially leans into emotional grief instead of action spectacle. Yes, there are flashes of violence, shattered equipment, emergency vehicles, panicked confrontations, but the emotional core remains heartbreakingly intimate. A husband forgetting which memories belong to him, a wife hearing her own thoughts spoken aloud by someone else, a child watching both parents slowly disappear psychologically while remaining physically present. That's tragic science fiction, not escapist science fiction. And I think audiences can feel that difference immediately. The very last exchange before the trailer ends completely wrecked me the first time I heard it. Daniel asks Evelyn, "When did we stop seeing each other?" And after a long silence, she responds, "I think we stopped seeing ourselves first." Cut to black.